So you want to use the Fuji X100V for video. Look, I don't blame you. It's a great compact camera. Stills from it are amazing. My Fuji camera has performed great. I made a video on it, so if you have any questions about it, while it covers mainly stills, in that video, we kind of go over a broad overview. Feel free to check it out. The link will be in the description. But in terms of actually taking video with the X100V, it's a totally different monster altogether. So let's kind of jump into why I wouldn't recommend this camera for video. Okay, so to start off, while I don't recommend this camera at all for video, for a while it was my best option for recording footage for YouTube and Reels and all that stuff. Before I had this X100V, really my only option was my A7R Mark II. And honestly, this camera is not really made for video. It's great for stills. It is so amazing. Video coming soon. I highly recommend this camera if you want to get into like professional photography. But for video, it kind of suffers. The color grading isn't that good, and there's so much more stuff that I can get into. So when I got the X100V, even though I had the A7R Mark II, this was really what I was shooting most of my videos in. But while I said I used to use this as my main video camera, let's actually talk about why you shouldn't and why I can't recommend this camera for video. Okay, so first of all, the Fuji, as I mentioned in the first video that I made about it, this is not a workhorse camera. Again, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that you shouldn't take this for professional commercial work where you're getting paid to do this. Why am I saying that? A big reason why this is not a workhorse camera is it doesn't have interchangeable lenses. That's a big issue, and it's hard to recommend this for up-and-coming videographers. Now, while you can mount a telephoto conversion lens and a wide-angle lens to change it, it's not a far enough zoom in terms of the telephoto. It only gets you to about 50 millimeters, which is an issue because if you're trying to shoot like a wedding where you can get close enough to the couple during, let's say, ceremony or during their first dance or reception, you know, that's where you need a zoom lens, and this doesn't really do the job. So that's kind of a big issue. Yeah, just the not having an interchangeable lens makes this impossible to recommend for commercial work. The next reason I can't recommend this camera is it doesn't shoot 4K 60, which, okay, you know what, like, I would have expected that Fuji had 4K 60 on this camera, even if it was in like some cropped mode. This is one of Fuji's more modern cameras of their era. You know, the X100 is kind of their pocket series, and the V is their most modern version, no 4K 60. Okay, but I found that even shooting 4K 30 was an issue. I was constantly having it overheat for longer video sessions. So ultimately, at the end of the day, either this was shooting at 1080p or it was being relegated as a B-roll camera for 4K 30. So I would record like small reels or B-roll footage or something on this camera at 4K 30, but nothing longer than like a minute and a half, because after that, it might overheat. Now, I have heard, and I think I agree with this statement, that if you extend the flip out screen, what that does is it helps with heat dissipation. This is something you should know if you want to use this camera for video. So if you are wanting to shoot 4K 30 and 60, or not 60, it doesn't do 60. If you want to do 4K 30, flip the screen out. Like that's it. That's really the only thing you can do to improve it. Now, for other stuff for video, while it does have microphone jack, great, thank God, it is not your standard 3.5 millimeter size. It is actually a 2.5 millimeter, meaning that you have to have an adapter if you want to shoot with this camera and an external mic. That's kind of a big issue. You know, it just makes it all more cumbersome. Another issue is that this doesn't have a dedicated video button. Now, even my Sony A7R Mark II that came out in 2015 has a dedicated video button on the side. Why is this an issue? You know, why? Like, who cares? Well, if you're trying to shoot as a hybrid shooter, meaning you're shooting photo and video for some reason, which I have done a lot in the past recently, there isn't a button to just quickly go to video, right? There might be a custom button somewhere, but in terms of a dedicated button, there is not. So what I have to do is, if I'm shooting photo, I have to click on the drive mode select, swap over to video, click on it, and then I'm ready to go with the shutter button. This is kind of an issue because you might risk missing a moment, you know? Like if you're trying to switch settings on your camera and then someone does something that you missed on photo or video, that's an issue, right? So again, it's not a workhorse. It's not something that will cover you in every situation. So just keep that in mind. Another thing is that manual focus on this camera is really difficult to do. While there is like a small little ring and there's a manual option, I found that it's really tedious to do, especially on the fly video shooting. So I wouldn't recommend manual focusing, which is an issue because there's a lot of cool video shots you can do that you need to do with manual focusing, but this camera doesn't really let you do that. So just kind of keep that in mind. What I usually do instead is I have it on back button autofocus, meaning it'll only focus if I press a certain button, have it on auto focus it to where I want it, and then just let it go, right? So focus it with back button and then pull it away or move it wherever I need it. But I'm still at the mercy of having to do auto to refocus or focus on another plane. So to keep in mind though is there are touch functions in this camera. Again, I didn't really cover too much touch functions because I had an issue where if I was looking through, I was worried it might focus in. So try touch button for focusing, but in terms of like a pure manual experience, that's not really it. The dial's too small and it doesn't work with any external focus gear setups. So that's another issue, is you can't really mount anything to it to help with manual focusing. Now, my second biggest disappointment is that there is not a fully articulating screen, right? Like it does articulate just a little bit, but it's not, you can't use it as like a vlogging camera. You can't use it, you know, to kind of take selfies because the screen doesn't go all the way out so the person in the front can see it. And that's kind of sad. I think ultimately this would have been a great vlogging camera, like a little pocket camera you can kind of take out and use. But the screen's an issue, right? So just kind of keep that in mind, is it would have been really nice if you had just been able to have the articulating screen, but you don't have it. And lastly, the biggest reason that I can't recommend this camera is the lack of in-body image stabilization for video. So this camera, wow, it takes great stills, and even at lower shutters, it's great. For video, the footage is really shaky. It is incredibly shaky. And it basically means that you can rarely shoot it handheld and you need a gimbal, which, you know, we'll go over into why you shouldn't do that in a bit, but ultimately it's just size. You know, we got this camera because it's small, you know, and you can put it in your pocket and you throw it in a bag. But if you can't really record video using just this, then pick something else up, you know? So that's kind of an issue, is in-body stabilization is just not there, and it makes the footage look way, way worse than it should. So just kind of keep that in mind. Okay, so we covered why you shouldn't use this camera for video, but I did mention that I was using this over my A7R Mark II. So why? Why did I decide to use this for video? To be perfectly honest with you, two main reasons: the color grading and the compactness of this camera. Let's move on to color grading first. The F-Log on this plus Fuji's own LUT is amazing. Like it just, boom, it does 90% of the work for you. So I think out of that, for like new videographers, for new colorists, this is a great little option because it makes color grading so much easier. My biggest issue with my Sony A7R Mark II is that S-Log2 on this was the worst thing to color grade. It was so bad and it was so difficult to use, so I couldn't recommend it for quick video turnarounds and just having a consistent look on all your footage. So while I was saving up for my brand new, which is what I'm using to record this video, my A7 IV, this was my main video camera. You know, if it wasn't in the frame, it was probably what I was using to record all of my footage. You know, yeah, I still need to improve my color grading. You see that in some of my videos. There still lacks some contrast, and part of it is just the lens. You know, it doesn't have enough depth of field and the smaller APS-C format, but it just made the editing so much easier. Like it just, I don't know what it was, but it was a joy to work with this log footage versus the Sony log footage that I had. Now, to be fair, this log footage is the easiest thing. S-Cinetone is the bomb, but we'll do another video far in the future about the A7 IV. Right now, Fuji X100V, color grading stuff is incredibly easy to do in my opinion. So that's a good positive for this camera. And then the second reason I mentioned was it's compact. Now, let's kind of talk about that. Now, I mentioned that, you know, if you're trying to shoot handheld, it's shaky footage. And yeah, okay, that makes sense. But ultimately, it's still footage, right? My most important motto for video or for photo is the best camera you have with you is the camera you always have with you, right? It doesn't matter if you have a Red Dragon or a Sony FX9 or a big cinema camera if you can't carry it with you when there's a moment that you need to capture. This camera I basically always have with me. So, okay, yeah, the footage is shaky, but if I'm just doing something quick, if it's not super professional, right, it's just a memory, that's what this is for. You know, I think a lot of people forget that photography is about capturing moments, not just making the most perfect image. So I have used this for like stuff like Instagram Reels or small moments with family and friends. You know, this works, you know, and there's no extra video equipment needed, especially because I can also shoot photo on this. This is like an all-in-one little package. Now, again, it's not the best video, but it does the job, which is ultimately what's important. Now, to be fair, if I did need to use this for commercial work, and I have actually in the past, I mount it on a gimbal. Now, I think, to be fair, most video work you would still mount it on, you would still mount your camera on a gimbal, but this is lighter and less cumbersome than this, especially because this doesn't even have a lens on it, right? With like a 50 or whatever. And yeah, the quality might look a little better with the lens on this, but ultimately this is just a lighter package. It's easier to run around with all day, you know, and it does the job. So yeah, a gimbal just makes it way more cumbersome, but ultimately it would still be a lighter setup than if I mounted my Sony cameras on a gimbal. So it still works out. And ultimately for my YouTube videos, I just stick this on a tripod. Like, there's no shaky footage if the camera isn't moving, right? So it's worked for 90% of the stuff I need. And just kind of cover two more quick tips for this camera and positives is the autofocus, in my opinion, is way better than my old Sony a7R Mark II. Granted, this 4 friggin' rocks, but when I just had this autofocus was better for eye tracking and stuff than my Sony. I don't like to set my cameras on manual focus for video because of my experience with this, but this let me just set it on autofocus and just leave it, right? Second thing is it has a built-in ND filter. If you're a pro video and you hate having to carry extra NDs, this just has it built in right in front of the sensor. It wasn't able to be used with video and when the camera first came out, but with a recent firmware update, Fuji made it to where you can run an ND using the ND filter for video. I think it's incredible. Again, it just makes it more compact. Do you get where I'm going with this? Is ultimately, you can always have this camera. And while it's a headache, it is a massive headache for certain things for video. Shaky footage, you know, having to switch to video mode, and the other stuff I covered. It's a good camera, you know, and the image quality looks great, especially with like a ProMIS filter, which I basically have on it by default. So while I can never recommend this camera, I can recommend it for myself. And if you just have it, you know, if you're already doing photos, feel free to try out video, you know, check out Fuji's website. They have a full LUT list that they made, one of them being specifically for this camera that will make your color grading easy as heck. So try that out, you know, consider it. And while it has a lot of limitations, you know, work with the gear that you have. If you have this camera or nothing else, try recording some footage. You know, if anything, stick it on a tripod. That's what most of the shots are good for anyways. You know, you don't really need all crazy movement stuff. So yeah, just kind of keep that in mind. And that's going to be it for this video. I'm going to keep it short. If you have any questions about this camera, feel free to ask about it in the comment section. I'll try to leave some descriptions and stuff about the video specs in the description as well if you want to read that. And in terms of liking and subbing or whatever, I don't really care about that stuff. You know, if you want to sub, that's more for, oh, I want to see what videos are coming out, but don't feel like you need to sub or like. But do check me out on Instagram though. That's one thing where I'm like, okay, cool, like check out my photo work because that's what I'm more proud of. But yeah, look, I love informing you guys. I love learning. And so if you have any questions about this camera, I'm gonna have this camera for a while. If you want me to test anything out on it, I would love to. Other than that, have a good one, have a good rest of your day, and I will be talking to you later. Peace.